I just want to say good morning to everyone and welcome to the Zoom presentation brought to you by Washington's Trail 1753. I'm Debbie Coral. I'm a volunteer with the group. I'm on the board and the steering committee. And this presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the website, washingtonstrail.org, and on the Washington's Trail YouTube channel. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Please make sure your microphone is kept muted. This way we will be able to better hear our speaker. We've allowed time for questions at the end of this presentation, which you can ask by using the chat feature that you will find at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. Type your question, hit enter, and we'll get to as many as we can. Mary, would you prefer we not interrupt you, or should we take a few minutes every once in a while to stop and look for questions?
Either one would be fine.
Okay, so we'll kind of play it by ear. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to just get up for a minute and close the door. We've got a 4-month-old puppy who is liable to go off.
Okay. So Washington's Trail 1753 is a registered Pennsylvania nonprofit that works to inform the public about the historic importance of Washington's 1753 mission. It's a mission that brought this 21-year-old George Washington to Western Pennsylvania and Maryland and directly led to the outbreak of the French-Indian War in North America. We have several upcoming events. This month, there are going to be several cherry pie hikes in honor of George Washington's 291st birthday. Information on these hikes are found at washingtonstrail.org and look under the events tab. And these aren't necessarily sponsored by us, but by our partners. We have another webinar coming up March 15th. Hopefully there'll be no technical difficulties. And at that one, we'll learn about George Washington's surveying office and it's a historical site in Winchester, Virginia. And on April 20th, we'll have our annual Washington's Trail Summit, an all-day in-person seminar featuring 6 speakers about the different forts Washington visited in the 1750s. Tickets for this program are $60 and include breakfast, lunch, the 6 speakers, and history-related vendors. Tickets for this program are available on Eventbrite, and more information is again found at our website, washingtonstrail.org. And now to our speaker. Mary Thompson is the research historian emerita at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Having worked at Mount Vernon for some 40 years, she's the author of numerous papers on George Washington and has written 3 Washington-related books. In the Hands of Good Providence, Religion and the Life of George Washington, a short biography of Martha Washington, and The Only Unavoidable Subject of Regret, George Washington, Slavery, and the Enslaved Community at Mount Vernon. We're so pleased to have you with us, Mary. And again, to everyone who's just joined, we had some technical difficulties this morning and we're getting started a little bit late. Mary's agreed to continue with us. So here's Mary.
Good morning. I was really excited to be, you can probably hear the puppy in the background. I was really excited when I was asked to speak today. My father's family for many generations lived in Western Pennsylvania and Washington, and in the town of Washington, Pennsylvania. And my great-great-grandfather fought with the 100th Pennsylvania during the Civil War. So let me go ahead and get started, and I'll try to talk fast. George Washington, of course, was born in 1752 or 32 into a world in which slavery was simply a fact of life. The first Africans had arrived in Virginia more than 100 years earlier, and new research has shown that, contrary to long-held beliefs among several historians, most of those people were enslaved from the outset. The basic outlines of the legal status of slaves in Virginia were clarified in the 1660s and 1670s with the passage of legislation stating that whether children born in Virginia were free or enslaved depended on the condition of their mother. That was passed in 1662. Conversion to Christianity and subsequent baptism would not result in freedom for a slave, 1667, which was contrary to hundreds of years of European precedent. Masters would have almost total control over how their slaves were disciplined and would not be prosecuted if a slave died while being punished. That was passed in 1669. And the government would police slaves, and owners would be reimbursed for any slaves who were killed while being recaptured. That passed in 1672. As noted by historian John Coombs, even before the supposedly critical turning points of statutory recognition of slavery in the 1660s and the beginning of direct African deliveries in the mid 1670s, only a handful of Blacks in Virginia were held in the capacity as servants. The normative condition for Negroes was enslavement. And with few exceptions, that period of enslavement lasted for the lifetime of the individual. The story of the Washington family in America began in the mid 1650s when two young men, John and Lawrence Washington, arrived in Virginia. Their family had been loyal to the deposed King, Charles I, during the English Civil War, and the brothers saw little future for themselves in England as long as Oliver Cromwell and Parliament were in control of the government. Both quickly established themselves, volunteering for public service and marrying well as stepping stones to advancement. Although there is earlier evidence that the Washingtons owned slaves in the 17th century, the first specific mention of enslaved people in the Washington wills came with the death of John Washington's grandson, Augustine, who died in 1743, leaving land and slaves to his widow and children. One of those children, the eldest son of his second marriage, was an 11-year-old boy named George Washington, who was due to inherit the 280-acre farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia, upon which the family was then living, and 10 Negro slaves from his father. As a minor at the time of his father's death, that boy would not take possession of those slaves until he reached the age of 18, when, because of a birth among the slaves, he actually inherited 11 enslaved people. In the coming years, through additional bequests from relatives, as well as his marriage to Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy young widow, also purchases, rentals, and natural increase through births in the enslaved community, Mount Vernon's population grew to a total of 217 enslaved people in 1786 and 316 in 1799 when George Washington died. Prior to the American Revolution, George Washington was involved in a number of business ventures that suggested he viewed slaves as nothing more than property. Washington, for example, was one of the managers of a raffle in which the property of an old friend, Bernard Moore, was sold to pay back creditors, including the Custis estate. Among the things being auctioned off that December day in 1769 were 55 slaves, including 6 families and 5 women with 1 or more children. The enumeration of prizes to be won at this raffle clearly showed that families were being split up in a rather cavalier manner. 2 years later, Washington agreed to make a long-term interest-free loan so that Moore could, quote, purchase slaves for the immediate support of his family. There were several factors that might have led to Washington's early, unthinking acceptance of slavery as an institution. As he was growing up, most of the people with whom he and his family associated were probably either already slave owners or, if not, would have aspired to become slave owners. With the Bible largely serving as the primer for young people in Virginia in the 18th century, Washington and his contemporaries were exposed at an early age to additional cultures in which slavery was a fact of life. Early in the Old Testament, for example, the patriarch Abraham had a child with his bondwoman or slave, Hagar. Abraham's great-grandson Joseph, the son of Jacob, was sold by his elder brothers to Midianite traders, who sold him in turn as a slave to an Egyptian official. Several centuries later, Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt through a series of events chronicled in the book of Exodus and recalled frequently elsewhere in the Bible. In the New Testament, the, quote, merchants of the earth are depicted weeping over the destruction of Babylon, where they can no longer sell their merchandise, including cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and the quote souls of men. During this period, people might be enslaved either as war captives or, in the case of debt, could sell themselves or family members in order to pay off money they owed. Throughout the Bible, while there are references to slavery, there are no direct indictments of it as an institution. St. Paul's epistle to Philemon deals with the treatment of a runaway slave who was voluntarily returning to his owner after both men became Christian. Paul encouraged Philemon to receive Onesimus, the slave, back, not as a servant, but rather as, quote, a brother beloved. Elsewhere, servants, as they were called, were told to count their own masters worthy of all honor, and if their masters were fellow believers, not to despise them because they are brethren, but rather do them service because they are faithful and beloved, partakers of benefit. While slavery was never condemned or forbidden, there are statements that provide seeds for a new way of thinking, perhaps even as far as the abolition of slavery, much as Thomas Jefferson's phrase in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, all men are created equal, has propelled an expansion of rights to many groups of people Jefferson may not have intended. In Genesis, the reader was told that God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created he them. More explicit were the words of St. Paul stating that, quote, for ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond, meaning an enslaved person, nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Another source of instruction for young children were authors and stories from ancient Greece and Rome, both of which were societies in which human beings were enslaved. Looking at just one such book, aimed primarily at children and young people, the Fables of Aesop featured short stories about people and animals, ending with a moral point. A number of these stories dealt with slavery. In one, the rivalry between a horse and a boar was settled when man made a deal with the horse to get revenge on his enemy, the boar. Man proposed that the horse let him put a saddle and bridle on him, and then let the man ride on his back with a lance in his hand and kill the boar. The horse agreed to this plan, and his enemy was eliminated, but at the cost of his own enslavement. In another tale, a sick man promised the gods to sacrifice 1,000 bullocks if they would only heal him. As a test of the man's honesty, the gods did restore his health, only to find him offering, quote, so many pieces of paste made up in the shape of oxen upon an altar instead of the real thing. As punishment, the man was given a dream, telling him to go to the coast where he would find a large treasure. While he was searching for this prize, the man was captured by pirates and sold into slavery. In a third tale, following a successful battle against a rooster, the victor flew to the top of the house to crow about his win when an eagle swooped in and carried him off, leaving the loser to take over the barnyard for himself. Aesop explained that it fares often with the greatest of monarchs, as with these cocks. He that is victorious today may be a slave tomorrow. All of these stories taught that slavery was something that happened to people who let their emotions get the better of their ability to think, or were greedy or prideful, and may well have led their young readers to believe that enslavement was justified as a form of punishment. Washington may well have been in his 30s before he ever heard anything critical of slavery. That criticism came from his longtime friend and neighbor, George Mason of Gunston Hall Plantation, who wrote in 1765 that the policy of encouraging the importation of free people and discouraging that of slaves has never been duly considered in this colony, or we should not at this day see one half of our best lands in most parts of the country remain unsettled and the other cultivated with slaves, not to mention the ill effect such a practice has upon the morals and manners of our people. One of the first signs of the decay, and perhaps the primary cause of the destruction of the most flourishing government that ever existed, was the introduction of great numbers of slaves, an evil very pathetically described by the Roman historians, but 'tis not the present intention to expose our weakness by examining this subject too freely. Washington's first public statement on the subject of slavery, 9 years later, was less a critique of slavery than of the slave trade. As tensions mounted with Britain and Virginia's royal governor dissolved the House of Burgesses, Washington served as chairman of the general meeting of the freeholders and inhabitants of the county of Fairfax to determine what actions he and his fellow citizens were willing to undertake to support Boston in their problems with the British government, especially in regard to banning commerce with the mother country. The document they drew up and signed, known as the Fairfax County Resolves, included as the 17th item the belief that, quote, during our present difficulties and distress, no slaves ought to be imported into any of the British colonies on this continent, and we take this opportunity of declaring our most earnest wishes to see an entire stock forever put to such a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade. One thing to keep in mind about this document is that it was critical of the slave trade rather than of slavery in general. Probably the biggest factor in the evolution of Washington's views on slavery was the Revolutionary War, in which he risked his life, his family, a sizable fortune, and a stable future, fighting to obtain freedom from England based on some relatively new and idealistic concepts about the rights of man. During the conflict, his views on slavery were radically altered, evidence that he truly believed the wartime rhetoric about freedom and liberty. Washington himself made use of this language and could hardly fail to see the irony when he expressed the view to an old friend in the summer of 1774 that the British authorities, quote, from whom we have a right to seek protection, were endeavoring by every piece of art and despotism to fix the shackles of slavery upon the Americans. 2 years later, in orders to his soldiers at Cambridge, he reminded them that it is a noble cause we are engaged in. It is the cause of virtue and mankind, and that freedom or slavery must be the result of our conduct. In July of the same year, Washington challenged his army with the idea that the time had almost arrived, quote, which must probably determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves. In contrast to their lives as free men who would have any property they can call their own, defeat would mean being consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will probably deliver them. He closed by challenging the soldiers to show the whole world that a free man contending for liberty on his own ground is superior to any slavish mercenary on earth. If the Americans could not see it for themselves, the enemy did not hesitate to point out the rebels' hypocrisy on the matter of slavery. One of the best known statements on this subject was Samuel Johnson's quip, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Washington's slave owning was used as another reason to hold this foremost leader of the revolution in contempt. Responding to a wartime rumor that Washington had been captured by the British, an English traveler in America named Nicholas Creswell responded with sarcasm. After noting that Washington's great caution will always prevent him being made a prisoner to our inactive general, Creswell described the American commander as a most surprising man, one of nature's geniuses, a heaven-born general, if there is any of that sort. What really irked Creswell was that a Negro driver, so he's referring to an overseer, a phrase for an overseer or foreman, should, with a ragged banditti of undisciplined people, the scum and refuse of all nations on earth, so long keep a British general at bay, nay, even oblige him with as fine an army of veteran soldiers as ever England had on the American continent, to retreat. It is astonishing. It is too much. By heavens, there must be double dealing somewhere. When Washington wrote a few years after the close of the war that liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth, he was simply noting what he had found to be true in his own life. Within 3 years of the start of the war, Washington, who was then 46 years old and had been a slave owner for 35 years, confided in a cousin back in Virginia that he longed every day more and more to get clear of the ownership of slaves. The only option he had for doing that at this point was to offer them for sale, because Virginia slave owners were unable to free their enslaved property until 1782. As he explained a few months later, it would be a matter of very little consequence to me whether my property is in Negroes or loan office certificates. But in trying to decide about selling them off, he admitted to having scruples arising from a reluctance in offering these people at public venue, and on account of the uncertainty of timing the sale well, meaning he would get as much money as possible for the sale. He also believed that, quote, if these poor wretches are to be held in a state of slavery, I do not see that a change of masters will render it more irksome, provided husband and wife and parents and children are not separated from each other, which is not my intention to do. About a decade later, Washington refused to purchase a particular slave, commenting that he already had as many slaves as I wished, and that he was not willing to exchange others for him, because I do not think it would be agreeable to their inclinations to leave their connections here, and it is inconsistent with my feelings to compel them. These scruples would have important implications for the management of Mount Vernon. It was also during the war that Washington saw Black soldiers in action, fighting alongside whites in the Continental Army. In fact, within 7 months of taking command of the Army, Washington approved the enlistment of free Black soldiers, something he and the other general officers had originally opposed. They began in late 1775 by re-enlisting free Blacks who had fought in the Army previously and been let go, much to their disappointment, when Congress disapproved of their presence in the Army. 5 years later, Washington proposed a method for reorganizing 2 Rhode Island regiments, noting that objections could best be handled by dividing the Black soldiers who made up the one unit evenly between 2 and making up the difference with new recruits, so as to abolish the name and appearance of a Black corps. In essence, integrating the Army, which it wouldn't be again until after World War II. During the Revolution, Washington was exposed to the views of several idealistic young men who ardently opposed slavery and whose opinions he valued. John Laurens of South Carolina, for example, proposed the formation of an African American corps in his home state of South Carolina, after service in which the soldiers would receive their freedom. Early in 1782, when trying to determine what the British would do next, and thinking that they might send reinforcements to Charleston, Washington wrote to Laurens that I know of nothing which can be opposed to them with such a prospect of success as the corps you have proposed should be levied in Carolina. Within a little more than 2 years after the end of the war, Washington's former aide, Alexander Hamilton, had become one of the earliest supporters of the Society for Promoting a Manumission of Slaves, and signed a petition to the New York legislature calling for the abolition of the slave trade, something he referred to as a commerce repugnant to humanity and inconsistent with the liberality and justice which should distinguish a free and enlightened people. Laurens sadly died during the war, but Hamilton and another of Washington's favorites, the Marquis de Lafayette continued to correspond about the abolition of slavery. When he learned about the formation of the Manumission Society from a New York newspaper, Lafayette wrote to his former brother-in-arms that he felt the wording against the slavery of Negroes was done in such a way as to give no offense to the moderate men in the Southern states, an acknowledgement of the sensitivity of the issue in American politics. Knowing Hamilton's views on the subject, he noted that, as I ever have been partial to my brethren of that color, I wish if you are one in the society, you would move in your own name for my being admitted to the list. The Revolution also brought Washington into contact with a gifted young woman, Phyllis Wheatley, who would have opened his eyes to, or at the very least led him to question the abilities of the Africans and African Americans with whom he had lived since childhood. Captured and enslaved as a girl of 7 or 8 in Africa, Wheatley was brought to Boston, where she was purchased by a tailor, John Wheatley, as a servant for his wife. Both Mrs. Wheatley and her daughter Mary are credited with instructing the young maid, using the Bible and the literature of classical Greek and Rome as textbooks. Treated very much as a member of the family and assigned only light duties, Phyllis blossomed under the Wheatleys' encouragement and began writing poetry by the time she was about 13. And this in English, so in a language that was new to her. 4 years later, one of her poems, written on the death of the international preacher and evangelist George Whitefield, was published. At 20, the young woman was taken to London in the hope that the sea air would improve her health. Then, there, one of her correspondents, Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, who was a prominent figure in both the Anglican evangelical movement and Methodism, introduced Wheatley to English society. During the same period, a book of Wheatley's works was published in England under the title Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. Before she could be presented to King George III at court, however, she learned that Mrs. Wheatley was very ill back in Boston and returned to America to care for the woman who had given her the gift of an education in the last months before her death in March 1774. About a year and a half later, in October 1775, Phyllis Wheatley sent a letter to George Washington from Providence, Rhode Island, assuring him that she wished, quote, Your Excellency that she wished Your Excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in. She enclosed a long laudatory poem she'd written in his honor. Perhaps a bit formal and flowery for modern tastes, the poem includes numerous classical allusions and closes with the words, Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine. 4 months later, Washington sent both the letter and poem on to his friend Joseph Reed in Philadelphia, and they were later published in at least 2 newspapers in the colonies. Washington also wrote directly to Wheatley, thanking her for her work and inviting her to visit him at his headquarters. He went on to say that I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensations. Between the end of the Revolution and the start of his presidency, abolitionists began approaching Washington on the subject of slavery. Often they brought or sent pamphlets for Washington to read. By the end of his life, he had a small collection of these works by such authors, as Anthony Benezet, George Buchanan, Thomas Clarkson, Brian Edwards, and Granville Sharp, written between 1776 and 1793. At other times, they came seeking his support for their cause. On May 26, 1785, 2 Methodist bishops, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, arrived at Mount Vernon to ask Washington to sign an anti-slavery petition they were planning to present to the Virginia legislature. Coke recorded their conversation in his diary, noting that their host received us very politely and was very open to access. After dinner, they spoke directly with him about the grand business on which we came, showed him the petition, and asked him to sign it if the eminence of his station did not render it inexpedient for him to sign any petition. Washington replied that he shared their feelings about slavery and had signified his thoughts on the subject to most of the great men of the state. He did not, quote, see it proper to sign the petition, however, but would let the Virginia Assembly know how he felt about slavery if they ever took up the subject for consideration. A little over 5 months after their meeting with Washington, the two Methodist pastors' petition was read in the Virginia legislature on the 8th of November, 1785. It was rejected by that body 2 days later. A young Quaker, Robert Pleasants, challenged Washington on the issue of slavery in December of 1785, citing religious reasons for the American leader to emancipate his slaves. Pleasants himself, a leader of the abolition movement in Virginia, had manumitted 80 of his own slaves several years earlier. He began his letter by citing concerns about Washington's reputation and went on to say that he found it strange that Washington, who could forego all of the sweets of domestic felicity and expose thy person to the greatest fatigue and dangers in that cause, meaning liberty, should now withhold that inestimable blessing from any who are absolutely in thy power, and after the right of freedom is acknowledged to be the natural and unalienable right of all mankind. He suggested that perhaps Washington's hesitation in this instance was not the result of interested motives, meaning money, but rather of long custom, the prejudices of education towards a black skin, or that some other important concerns may have hitherto diverted thy attention from a subject so noble and interesting, as well as thy own peace and reputation, as the general good of that people and the community at large. Pleasants then offered his opinion that Washington should not delay in freeing his slaves, because it was a sacrifice which I fully believe the Lord is requiring of this generation. He went on to say that he wished that thou may not lose the opportunity of crowning the great actions of thy life with the satisfaction of doing to others as they would, in like situation, be done by, and finally to transmit to future ages a character equally famous for thy Christian virtues as thy worldly accomplishments. After reminding Washington of a coming day of judgment, Pleasants closed by hoping Washington would not think him presumptuous, stating that he had no selfish motives for offering these hints to his serious consideration, other than what may arise from the pleasure of hearing he had done these things, which belong to his present and future happiness and the good of those over whom Providence hath placed him. A decade later, during Washington's second term as president, a Welsh Baptist pastor came to Mount Vernon in Washington's absence to visit the estate. An ardent abolitionist, Reverend Morgan John Reese, later sent a letter to a friend in which he described what he saw, noting that if Mount Vernon was not the house of bondage to so many men, I would call it a little paradise. Despite the praise, however, Reese severely criticized Washington for hypocrisy. Had the President of the United States been at home, I would have addressed him thus: Thou great man, Washington, what meaneth the bleating like a sheep of these black sheep, and the lowing of these Negro oxen that till thy ground? Say not they belong to thy wife, they are entailed to her relatives as an inheritance. Such paltry excuses are beneath thy character. The great defender of liberty should give an example to his neighbors worthy of himself. How much more honorable to pay wages and let them support themselves. Experience evinced this even in this country, that it would be more profitable to the employer. Over and over again, Washington reiterated his conviction that the best way to effect the elimination of slavery was through the legislature, which he hoped would set up a program of gradual emancipation, and for which he would gladly give his vote. And I should mention that the states in New England, many of them had already, through their legislatures, gone ahead and set up emancipation for people who were enslaved in those states. The middle colonies took a different approach. Many of them were putting in plans for gradual emancipation, so that over the course of 20 or 30 years, everybody who was enslaved would have been freed, by that time. And then the states further south were primarily not doing anything to free enslaved people. Washington assured his friend Robert Morris in 1786 he hoped that no one would read his opposition to the methods of certain abolitionists, in this case the Quakers, as opposition to abolition as a concept. I hope it will not be conceived from these observations that it is my wish to hold the unhappy people who are the subject of this letter in slavery. I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it. But there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority, and this, as far as my suffrage will go, shall never be wanting. In the end, Washington would free those slaves at Mount Vernon who belonged to himself. Because Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Custis, had died intestate, without having a will, because of Virginia law at that time, the widow was given 1/3 of the enslaved people for the remainder of her life, and upon that death, her death, the remaining slaves from the Custis estate were to be divided up among Martha Washington's heirs. And by the time that happened in the late 18th century and early 20th century, 19th century, the slaves were divided, the remaining Custis slaves were divided among Martha's 4 grandchildren. Emancipating the Mount Vernon slaves was a complicated business. To reiterate the problem, in the 40 years of the Washingtons' marriage, the slaves on the estate had increased in number to over 300 people. 40 of these individuals were rented from a neighbor, while a little less than half of the remainder belonged to George Washington. And except for 2 or 3 individuals, the rest were owned by the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. And again, because Custis had died without a will, Virginia law directed that his widow receive a life interest in, or had what they called dower rights to 1/3 of the slaves in his estate. After her death, however, these slaves would revert to the surviving Custis heirs, who in this case were her 4 grandchildren. Adding further complexity and emotional distress to this situation was the fact that during this 40-year period, the Washington and Custis slaves had often intermarried, meaning that for many families, emancipation would bring great sadness, as husbands were separated from both their wives and their children, whose ownership was determined by that of their mother. About 20 couples and their children were divided for this reason. A few others were torn apart because they'd married other enslaved people on other plantations who were rented. The Washingtons were renting 40 slaves from a neighbor at the end of George Washington's lifetime. And so it's those enslaved people who were rented. Those families also were broken up. George Washington pretty much admitted in his will that it was the breakup breakup of families, which kept him from emancipating his slaves earlier. To emancipate them during Martha Washington's life would, though earnestly wished by me, be attended with such insuperable difficulties on account of their intermixture by marriages with the dour Negroes, as to excite the most painful sensation, if not disagreeable consequences from the latter, while both descriptions are in the occupancy of the same proprietor, it not being in my power, under the tenure by which the dour slaves are held, to manumit them. Of the more than 300 slaves known to have been at Mount Vernon in 1799, fewer than half, 123 individuals, belonged to George Washington and would go free. In addition, there were another 33 slaves who would become Washington's property upon the death of his brother-in-law, Bartholomew Dandridge, in 1785, as payment for a debt. These people were still living at the Dandridge plantation when Washington died, but he made arrangements in his will for their freedom too, after the death of Dandridge's widow. Washington asked that they be freed gradually, according to a schedule which varied depending on their ages. Those over 40 would be freed immediately. Those between 16 and 40 would be manumitted after another 7 years of labor, and anyone under the age of 16 would be manumitted at the age of 25. The 153 dour slaves at Mount Vernon would go to the Custis grandchildren after Martha Washington's death. All of the rented slaves, 40 individuals from a neighbor, Mrs. French, and stableman Peter Hardiman from the widow of Martha Washington's son, would eventually return to their owners. The one slave Martha Washington owned outright at the time of her death and could have manumitted, a mulatto man whose name is variously recorded as Elish, maybe an abbreviation of Elijah, or Elijah, who had been purchased by her from a Washington after the death of George Washington. She bequeathed to her grandchildren, or her grandson. So that's what I've got for you on this topic. Rodney had talked to me also about talking to you about Washington's experiences with slavery in Western Pennsylvania, but I don't know whether we have time to do that. So I can stop now or take questions or whatever you'd like to do.
Okay, Mary, thank you. A lot of very interesting information here. So we've allotted about an hour and 15 minutes for this Zoom. So I'm going to go to the questions in the chat. Mm-hmm. And I'd very much like to hear what you have to say about the next part of your topic, but I don't know, how much time would you need for that, do you think?
It's a bit over 10 pages, so probably there probably isn't. How much time do we have?
We have about another 15 minutes and then the Zoom, or less than 15 minutes, and then the Zoom will end. So, and maybe we can schedule that for a follow-up if you're agreeable.
Sure.
That'd be great. Okay, let's go to the questions. I'm going to read from the chat. Michael Robinson wants to know, how would you recommend an organization start doing research on the history of enslaved persons in Washington, Pennsylvania that were associated with the major players in the Whiskey Rebellion in the late 1700s? We know David Bradford, who led the rebellion, helped form societies against enslavement, but his family owned slaves in PA, and also at his plantation after he skedaddled to Spanish West Florida, later Louisiana. So the question is, how would you recommend an organization start doing research on the history of enslaved persons in Washington, PA?
You might want to start with reading some of the best admired or whatever secondary sources, just to kind of get everything clear in your head and make lists of who you're looking for. There may be tax lists from from Pennsylvania for this period. I'm just not familiar enough with those sources. So I'm sorry, I'm not much help with this. There may be manumission records for some of these people. The Historical Society in Pittsburgh is just the Heinz Center, is a really good museum, and they have a wonderful library, and were able to help me with some of the questions I had about enslaved people in Western Pennsylvania at the time.
Next question is Robert Wong. Were all or most enslaved Blacks who fought for the Patriots promised freedom after the war? Was it granted, or was it still up to their masters?
It seems like it was still up to their masters, although I don't think it should have been, because they had been promised in many cases that they would be freed. And I know Virginia made it possible in a case where someone had been promised freedom, and then the master sort of reneged on that promise. You could take them to court. The enslaved person could take the master to court for not following up, and in some cases they were.
Call from Rick.
At least it's in the other room. And where was I?
We're talking about the enslaved Blacks who fought for the Patriots, promised freedom.
Mm-hmm. So it was possible in Virginia to sue the master who was not keeping his promise.
Okay. Is it true that George Washington did not take communion because of his feelings about slavery?
That might have been part of it. According to his family, he and one of his pastors, he routinely took communion before the war. There's a reference to him taking communion once or twice during the war, and then afterwards he wouldn't take communion. And so in my first book, one of the things I looked at was why would someone stop taking communion when they had done so for their entire life? And my dad was an Army chaplain for 32 years. And I asked him one day about that. And he said, a lot of times it's because they feel unworthy because of things they had to do during the war, or things or things they had to order other people to do, that they would feel that they'd done something that it was wrong, and they felt really guilty about it. So I think that's part of it. There are a lot of other things going on too. There, right after the war, at least in Virginia, which was an Anglican colony, Virginia was transitioning from an Anglican colony, and were breaking with the Anglican Church in England in order to set up the Protestant Episcopal Church in Virginia. And Washington had some real issues with the first bishop of the new church, a man named Samuel Seabury, who had not only written before the war espousing people, encouraging people to stay with the government, stay with the old church, and which, you know, Washington had problems with. But the other thing he had problems with was that Bishop Seabury, that first Episcopal bishop, had on Long Island during the war guided British troops against Washington's, and he had issues with with that gentleman.
So it could be a whole lot of reasons why he
Mhm.
Okay, the next question. This person is asking, Barb Demarest is asking how she can find information. She says, as a guide at Morristown National Park, I would like to know the names of the enslaved who accompanied Martha to winter camp. How can I find this information?
I could try to help you find out. They usually do not mention who specifically went with Martha Washington, accompanied her as, you know, drivers and maids or something like that. So a lot of times you have to go back to yeah, you have to go back to the financial papers at Mount Vernon to see who's getting fancy new clothes to go north with Mrs. Washington during the war. And one of the really cool things about Martha Washington heading up there was she was with George Washington. We talk about it as she went up every winter, which sounds like a few months. When you add up all the time during the war that Mrs. Washington was with the general in camp or nearby, she was with him for half the war. So it's a little more complicated than just a few months. That she's away from home when 3 of her 4 grandchildren are being born. Her mother's having issues and their health issues and things like that. So there are a lot of reasons why she wouldn't have wanted to come, but she said she wanted to be with the general. And some of the best descriptions we have of her are from the times when she was in camp. And so a lot of people write about meeting her.
Then there's a couple of comments here about being an excellent seminar. Thank you for that. Also, Joanne asked, is it possible to get a hard copy of the report? And I don't want to put you on the spot here, so perhaps that's a conversation we have offline and decide what to do. I don't see any other questions.
Okay.
Oh, yes, there is. There's one more here. And we're getting low on time here. Did George Washington arm slaves to protect Martha Washington while he was away?
Not that I've ever seen. His third cousin, Lund Washington, had been hired by George Washington in the 1760s to be an overseer or sort of farm manager for him at Mount Vernon. And there is no evidence that any of the slaves were armed. I believe Lund probably would have been armed, and maybe some of the overseers. We know later in the 1780s and 90s that some of the slaves were armed, and that mostly so that they could hunt for themselves, for their own maintenance. And also they were often given rewards for picking up poachers. And so they did have guns. And one of the things that the archaeologists at Mount Vernon have found was that they found, bullets, they found shot, they found, and then there are references to doling out gunpowder and stuff to the few enslaved people who were trusted enough to have guns.
Okay. One final comment, and then I think we will end here. This person, Susan Martin, says, excellent presentation. What an unholy mess Washington found himself in.
Yes.
And then somebody did just jump in and say any info about descendants of Washington enslaved community, but we're out of time now. So I don't think maybe we can save that for the next
well, we
round
now
two.
I was doing stuff like that for years, sort of as an additional duty. And we now have a staff member who is hired specifically to work with descendants and try to, prove that their families were at Mount Vernon and that kind of thing. And so it's just really getting going, but yeah, we are doing that.
Through Mount Vernon. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you to everyone, and thank you to our speaker, to Mary. Thank you. As I mentioned, this program has been recorded and will soon be available for viewing on the Washington's Trail website, washingtonstrail.org. We hope you can join us at the next free webinar on March 15th, and that's on the Washington Surveyor. And at our all-day summit on April 20th at the Butler Country Club near Butler, Pennsylvania. And the details for that, for those events are at our website. And we'll, as we have conversation with Mary about a follow-up, we'll get that message out to everyone who registered for today, and also through our newsletter. As you visit the Washington Trail website, you'll also notice a donate button. Your support helps us to keep these programs happening. And this concludes our program. Thank you all for attending. And thank you again, Mary. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.